If you've ever had a client ask you for a rigorous impact evaluation, how do you have that conversation with them about what makes an impact evaluation rigorous? In this video, I'll be talking about internal validity and the role that it plays in impact evaluations. And hopefully you get some pointers from this video that helps you have those conversations with your clients more easily. In this video, when we talk about an impact evaluation, we're talking about a study that tries to quantify the changes in an outcome that can be attributed to a program or intervention. And in this video, I'll use this example of a fictitious math intervention called 1-2-3 Math that's intended for second graders who are struggling to meet academic standards in math. And when we talk about internal validity, we're talking about the extent to which the impact evaluation is actually identifying the effect of the intervention on the outcome. And so in the example of our 1-2-3 Math intervention, internal validity really refers to our ability to say that the results that we see are because of the 1-2-3 Math intervention. So imagine you've completed an impact evaluation for your client and you've done some data analysis and you get results, and the results suggest that the intervention resulted in a 10-point increase on average in math ability, however that's being measured, and you attribute that to 1-2-3 Math. Well, if the study had very low internal validity, it may be the case that in actuality, the 10-point change wasn't just because of 1-2-3 Math. Maybe 5 points of it were because of something else, another intervention that the students were getting that you didn't even know about. Maybe in reality, the 1-2-3 Math's impact is actually on average -2 points. But again, you have no clue. You just have a study with low internal validity, and so you shouldn't really count on this number as an accurate reflection of the effect of 1-2-3 Math on math ability. In contrast, if you had a study with really high internal validity, you would really be able to be comfortable and feel confident in this number reflecting the effect of 1-2-3 Math on average on students' math ability. Your client might wonder what makes a study have low internal validity, or conversely have high internal validity. Or sometimes they might put it as being sort of more or less rigorous. Well, if you Google threats to internal validity, you'll usually see results, about 8 or 9 results listed here. And I'll give a couple of examples of what some of these are and how they might play out. But I encourage you to Google each of these here: history, selection, testing, regression, etc., because it's really helpful to know that these challenges or threats are lurking in any impact evaluation that you do. And the design you choose for your client's impact evaluation can either increase or decrease internal validity. And the way it does that is it directly addresses these threats or mitigates these threats. When you talk with your client, it's often helpful to describe different study designs in terms of where they fall along the continuum of internal validity, where studies at the low end have much less confidence that whatever result that you get is actually because of the intervention, and studies on the high end have much more confidence that the result that you get is actually because of the intervention. And studies can also fall somewhere in between these two extremes. It's also worth mentioning that even within these sort of broad buckets of 1, 2, 3, or low, medium, high, there are a lot of different study designs, and some that have relatively higher internal validity than others. Here's an example of the sorts of studies that I have come across often that have very low internal validity. And in these studies, there's typically no comparison group. They have a assessment being done in the beginning prior to the intervention being implemented, in this case 1-2-3 Math, and then they have assessment again after the intervention was implemented, and they have a score of 15 on average before the intervention, a score of 25 on average after the intervention. The evaluators quantify this difference and say, okay, that's 1-2-3 Math led to an increase of 10 points, and they call it a day. But there are a lot of these threats that are lurking in this kind of study. In this example, a history threat refers to this idea that in between when the students were assessed both times, in addition to the intervention, there could have been other things that contributed to this number. For example, if this was done during a school year, students receive instruction during that school year how much of that went into this 10 points? Another kind of threat is the selection threat. So, for example, what if all of these students came from the same school, and those teachers, the math teachers, received some professional development that really helped accelerate math performance for students who are struggling in second grade? How much of that is contributing to these 10 points? We don't know. Another threat that might appear here is the testing threat. So perhaps the same assessment was given in the beginning, and then before the intervention, and then again afterwards. And some of this increase is due to the fact that some students remembered some of the correct question, the correct answer for some of these questions. And so this is sort of artificially inflating this number beyond what you would actually attribute to the intervention itself. Because many of these threats are present, it really decreases the internal validity of this study and calls into question whether this number actually represents the effect of 1-2-3 math on this math outcome. Now, here's an example of a study that would be higher on the internal validity ladder. A lot of studies that fall into this sort of middle tier are referred to as quasi-experimental designs. And in this example, what we have here is, in addition to our group that received the 1-2-3 math intervention and they saw a change of 10 points, we have another group that did not receive the 1-2-3 math intervention, and they were assessed at the same time points. And the idea is that we can compare the growth in this group to the growth in this group, and then basically be able to infer that whatever is different in that growth is attributed to the 1-2-3 math group. And you can see how such a study design helps to try to alleviate some of these threats. So we talked about the history threat and said, well, for example, if this happened during a school year, students are receiving instruction. Well, if these students attend the same school, presumably they're receiving very similar instruction over this time frame. And so that helps us go look at this list and then say, well, maybe history is not so much of a problem here. Now, there could be other things that happened during this time frame that was different from the intervention group and the comparison group in ways that are unknown to the evaluators, but in ways that affect the actual growth. So there could still be lurking effects there. Another thing that that I should mention here also is that these quasi-experimental studies typically try to sort of attenuate the effect of some of these differences between the groups statistically and through other methods. And so it's through those methods that they try to sort of counteract the effect of some of these things. So for example, selection. We talked about how it may be the case that, in the previous example with the low internal validity, this 1-2-3 math group may have all come from the same school. Well, if this group also came from the same school, that helps alleviate that selection threat. And in the event that they came from different schools and we had information about the professional development that the different schools used, we could try to take that into account statistically, so that we're trying to systematically sort of take into account the selection threat, or mitigate that threat. Now, we call them a non-equivalent comparison group designs because the way in which these groups came about is typically unfolded in a way that the evaluators had no control. So like, these are students that happen to receive 1-2-3 math, and these are students that happen to not receive it. And because the evaluators had no control, there could be lots of reasons that these students ended up being in 1-2-3 math and these students did not, which again speaks to that threat of selection, and potentially sort of seeps into other issues that we might have that undermine the internal validity of the study. So that's why, in a nutshell, that this type of study design is better in terms of internal validity than the lower one, than the example that I talked about before, because it systematically tries to tackle some of these. But it's not quite as good as the next category of study designs. Here's an example of a study design that falls in the highest category of internal validity. These sorts of study designs are usually referred to as RCTs, or randomized control trials, or cluster randomized trials. The idea is that the evaluator has a hand in who receives the intervention. So, for example, the evaluator is able to determine which students receive the 1-2-3 math intervention and which students do not. And that mechanism through which students are put in the treatment group or the control group is random. And it's that random process that helps to just take away these threats of like history, because when you randomly assign, the experience students have over this time frame should be the same, with the exception that the treatment group received the treatment. It takes away the selection problem, because when you randomly assign from the same pool of students, then the distribution of students should be the same. It should be the same in terms of ethnicity, in terms of prior ability, all those sorts of things between the treatment and control group, which is why you usually see something like this, where the baseline assessment, so you randomly assign, take a baseline assessment, where those two groups tend to be equal. Because of the random assignment, and it can even help to mitigate some of these other issues also. And because of that, when the evaluators do something like compare the growth between the treatment group and the comparison group, in this case maybe a difference of 3 points on average, they can be confident that that difference is attributed to the 1-2-3 math. So hopefully it's clear that internal validity is an extremely crucial aspect of an impact evaluation. And I would argue that your goal should always be to try to maximize the internal validity of any impact evaluation that you perform for your client. And at the very least, just sort of lay out this logic and this idea that there are studies, impact evaluations with low, medium, and high internal validity, and there are trade-offs between choosing a study design that goes higher up on that ladder or lower on that ladder. Usually, the higher you go, the more control you need to exert, the more restrictions there are on how data are collected, and it can be more expensive. And your client might push back on that idea, but at least you're having an open and honest conversation about the trade-offs between more rigorous impact evaluation versus a less rigorous impact evaluation. And then they can do with it what they will depending on their needs. If you are ever in need of a methodologist or a statistician to help you carry out an impact evaluation, go to www.parsimonyinc.com and get a hold of me. I'd be happy to chat.